or leaving out some details. So here's my summary. At the end of the 19th century, a secret society was formed by Cecil Rhodes. Cecil Rhodes, as all of you know, I'm sure, was one of the wealthiest men in the world. He was the political head man in South Africa, the chancellor, I believe they called him. And while he was there, he was able to acquire control over all of the diamond deposits and the gold deposits of South Africa, all of the mineral reserves. And in that period of time, he amassed one of the greatest, if not the greatest, fortune in the world. What people don't realize is that when he died, none of that money went to his heirs. Where did it go? It went through a series of 7 wills to create a secret society. The purpose of the secret society was to create a structure that would literally control the world from behind the scenes in a fashion that the average man or woman would never see it or never suspect it even existed. The Rhodes Scholarship, which most people know about, was just the tip of the iceberg that was created in one of the wills of Cecil Rhodes. And the purpose of the Rhodes Scholarship was to provide a funnel or a recruiting mechanism to find the most appropriate, the most likely individuals, young men and women, who could be recruited into this secret society. It should come as no surprise that William Clinton was a Rhodes Scholar. Fits perfectly into this scenario. This secret organization is not just of historical interest. It exists today. And according to Quigley and other observers who are close to it, it is the most important single historical force in the world since World War I. I just think about that for a moment. Is it true? Well, we'll cover a few facts and you judge it for yourself. The goal of the secret organization originally was to expand the British Empire and the men who were behind it, not necessarily the royalty, but the real political figures behind it, and I'll mention some of their names in a moment, to extend the British Empire to control the world, because Rhodes and his associates believed that the British had acquired the highest culture, the highest level of morality, according at least to his definitions of morality, and the highest standard of living, the most perfect language. He felt that the race was superior, and that for the benefit of the rest of the world, for their good, it was their responsibility. This group, using the British Empire, was their responsibility to rule the world for the benefit of the world, of course. It was very carefully spelled out in their writings and their goals. Now, this evolved not too long after the organization was put into motion. It changed. The goal changed. World domination didn't change. Control from behind the scenes by a very small elect group didn't change. But what did change is that the focal point for this was no longer the British or the England, but it was to be a new world order, international in scope, and to be housed through an international organization of some kind. Initially, they had hoped that it would be the League of Nations, and all of their members worked very hard to create the League of Nations for that purpose. And when that failed, then they set their sights on the United Nations, which finally was put into action and now is on a fast track to becoming the very structure which they had projected as their goal. And now, of course, the center of all of this, instead of being in England, is focused primarily in New York. Now, the method by which this secret organization was to accomplish this incredible goal was not to be visible and not to go forth and influence the people directly. People weren't even supposed to suspect that such a thing was going on. The people were not even supposed to know the names, primarily, of the big players. They weren't to be in the news at all. The way this was to be done was indirectly, through the power centers of society, as they're called. The strategists behind this are brilliant, and they realized that human beings have a herd instinct. We clump together, most of us. A few hermits get off in the wilderness and do okay, but most of us get nervous out in the wilderness, and we congregate into villages and cities, and beyond that, we come together in organizations like this. We have leaders. We join labor unions. We affiliate with political parties. We come together in church organizations, and we send our kids to schools that are organized, and we have Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts. And the way we operate is that we work through groups and organizations, and we follow leaders. They had this all figured out. They said, therefore, the way for us to lead the masses is not directly one-on-one, but what we must do is control the leadership of the organizations to which people belong. We don't need that many people to do that. So with just 1% or 0.1% of the population, we can control the entire population by controlling the power centers of society. That was their strategy from the beginning, and it is their strategy today. And I might add, it is an extremely effective strategy. The structure of this secret organization was outwardly modeled after the Jesuit order. Yes, incredible, isn't it? But Rhodes was an admirer of the organizational genius in his mind of the Society of Jesus, the Jesuit order, and he said we should use that as our model. He didn't take it straight across, but he took many elements from it. And at the deeper level, though, it is interesting, I think, and very instructive to note, that he borrowed the structure of classic conspiracy control directly from Adam Weishaupt. Now, those of you who have studied this thing, you recognize that name. Adam Weishaupt was the founder of the Illuminati. And we all know a little bit about the Illuminati because it was disbanded in Bavaria shortly after it was formed. And their secret records and notebooks and so forth were seized and placed into the public record. So you can go to a library today and read verbatim the organizational structure of the original Illuminati. Now, there's a debate as to whether or not the Illuminati really was destroyed or whether it just went underground and still exists today. I think that debate is interesting, and I have my own opinions about it, but they're just opinions. In the final analysis, it's not too important because we know that there are shoots coming up from the ground with identical structures all over the place. Now, whether those shoots are coming up from seeds or roots, I don't think makes too much difference. The fact is that we have had many organizational imitations of the Illuminati, and this secret one that we're talking about here, created by Cecil Rhodes, is a perfect example. Now, what is that structure I'm talking about? It's what they call rings within rings within rings. That's the way they usually refer to it. And what that means is this. Weishaupt said that in the center of his Illuminati organization, there would be a controlling group of maybe 3 or 4 people, just a small number. These, in turn, would create a membership ring around them of a larger number, of perhaps 20 or 30 or something like that. And the members of that ring would not be aware that they were being dominated and controlled by the inner circle. Now, that outer ring then, in turn, thinking that they were the whole enchilada, would then create a larger ring around it, comprising of hundreds or perhaps thousands of people. And those people would not suspect that they were being dominated and directed by an inner ring. And then finally, that last ring would create still another one that would reach out to mass organizations, reach out to the masses. And in that fashion, Weishaupt said that a few of us in the center, through this carefully controlled structure of rings within rings, can control the world. And the people being controlled would never know that that's how it worked. Now that's the structure that Weishaupt created and described at some length, and it's interesting to me that Rhodes selected that very structure for his secret society. Now, let's take a look. Boy, I'm glad there's not lead attached to that. The result of all this, ladies and gentlemen, is that this structure, this secret society, remains invisible to the average person. And it remains invisible not only because of its structure and because of its secrecy, but also because it has had the foresight of not having a name. Now just think about that for a minute. If you say that you have an organization or you create an organization and somebody says, well, what are we going to call ourselves? And the answer is, we're not going to call ourselves anything. We're not going to have a name. That way, nobody can talk about us. Brilliant. And that's what they decided to do. Quigley himself doesn't know how to describe it. At some places in his books, he calls it the network. In other places, he calls it the Rhodes Group. In other places, he just calls it the group. It has no name. And so therefore, that's another reason that it's invisible to the average person today. Now, at the inner circle of this organization that I'm describing, that was called the Society of the Elect. It originally consisted of Cecil Rhodes and a small brain trust of his very wealthy and influential political cronies from British politics and British banking. The center of gravity, as I said earlier, shortly thereafter, after Rhodes' death, didn't take long before the center of gravity shifted away to the Rockefeller Group, which was very quick to move into that circle. And now we see that there are centers or secondary centers of influence within the Rockefeller Group and centers within such organizations as the Bilderberg Group and the Trilateral Commission, to name just a few. And the goal shifted away from creating a world empire based in England to a world empire based in New York called the New World Order, but based on the model of collectivism. Now, the secondary rings around this society of the elect that Cecil Rhodes created were called roundtables. That's the name they gave them, roundtables. And these existed in the United States, Britain, and all of the former British dependencies. Finally, there was a tertiary group or ring around that was created. Each of those roundtables in each of the countries created another ring larger around it. And they called those, in most of the British dependencies, they called those the Royal Institute for International Affairs. You'll find that in England, you'll find it in Canada, and so forth. That's what it's called. It's still there. Very powerful, prominent institutions in British politics in all of these countries. In the United States, for some reason which I've never been able to find out, they didn't choose that name, I suppose because royal wouldn't be an acceptable word in the United States. So in the U.S., they call it the Council on Foreign Relations. And ladies and gentlemen, after 100 years of penetration into the power centers of society, the Rhodesian network, which I call it, I have given it a name, and I hope you'll pick it up and use it because we have to identify this group. I call it the Rhodesian network or the Rhodesians. After 100 years, the Rhodesians now are very close to the final achievement of their goal in the Western world. Now, I add the phrase in the Western world because we must not lose sight of the fact when we're looking at this group that there is another group out there which is just as dangerous, just as secret, just as cunning as the Rhodesians. And they, by the way, took a clue from the Rhodesians and they got rid of their name a few years ago. We used to call them communists. And then they got rid of their name. They pretended to go away. They pretended that they crumbled overnight. Great miracle. They're still there. I call them the Leninists. They have never renounced the theories or the goals of Lenin. They just renounced communism. Well, they never really had communism in any of those countries anyway. They always referred to themselves as socialists or Leninists or what have you. But all the old former communist commissars simply took their hat off when it said communist on the front of it, and they turned it around, and now it said social democrat. But you notice it's the same heads underneath the hats. The heads didn't change, nor did their real policies. But I want to emphasize that there is another very large and powerful and dangerous group out there, which I call the Leninists. And the Leninists and the Rhodesians are often seen warring against each other. Just take a look at Mr. Bush in Washington, D.C., and in Venezuela we've got Chavez. Now there's a perfect example of the Rhodesians versus the Leninists. And they fight each other. They are opposed to each other. They criticize each other. They hate each other. But the world that they want is the same. The only thing they disagree with is not ideology. It's who is going to run this new world order. Is it going to be the so-called left, or will it be the so-called right? And when you peel off all of those labels and you look underneath, you'll find that in all of these camps, what they really stand for is collectivism. That's the word we should be using. They're all collectivist in nature. But then they wrap themselves in flags and different rhetoric, and they appear to oppose each other. But I want to emphasize, just because we are focusing tonight on one group does not mean that that is the only place we need to keep our guard up, because we have another equally potential group very much alive in the world today. Now, that is my summary. It's time now to let the conspirators describe it, and so I'm going to do some reading for you. I hate to do... I guess I'm blowing into this. Is that what I'm doing? I hate to read a lot in a speech, but in this case, I feel that I have to, because otherwise you'd think that I was making some of this up. So I'm going to do a little extensive reading and let you see that the conspirators themselves really have said basically what I have said. Now, we'll begin... Where am I? Okay. We'll begin in Tragedy and Hope by Carroll Quigley. And he says this. He says, I know of the operation of this network, because there he calls it a network, because I have studied it for 20 years and was permitted for 2 years during the 1960s to examine its papers and secret records. I have no aversion to it or to most of its aims, and have for much of my life been close to it and to many of the instruments. In general, my chief difference of opinion is that it wishes to remain unknown. Now, in the Anglo-American establishment, Quigley says this: the Rhodes Scholarship established by the terms of Cecil Rhodes' seventh will are known to everyone. What is not so widely known is that Rhodes, in 5 previous wills, left his fortune to form a secret society which was to devote itself to the preservation and expansion of the British Empire. And what does not seem to be known to anyone is that this secret society continues to exist to this day. To be sure, it is not a childish thing like the Ku Klux Klan, and it does not have any secret robes, secret handclasps, or secret passwords. It does not need any of these, since its members know each other intimately. It probably has no oaths of secrecy, nor any formal procedure of initiation. It does, however, exist and hold secret meetings. This group, as I shall show, is one of the most important historical facts of the 20th century. Now, one of the original leaders of this group, one of the organizers, was a fellow by the name of William Stead. Now, William Stead was so important that he was the executor of Cecil Rhodes' will. So he should know what he's talking about. And he wrote a book entitled The Last Will and Testament of C.J. Rhodes. And in that book, William Stead said this: Mr. Rhodes was more than the founder of a dynasty. He aspired to be the creator of one of those vast, semi-religious, quasi-political associations which, like the Society of Jesus, have played so large a part in the history of the world. To be more strictly accurate, he wished to found an order as the instrument of the will of the dynasty. So you see, they're looking at this like an order. It's not just a group or an organization. It's an order, like the Knights Templar or something like that. It's a chivalric order. In Cecil Rhodes' handwritten manuscript, this was not published until fairly recently, we find this coming directly from Cecil Rhodes' own pen. He said, I contend that we English are the finest race in the world, and that... I don't know what to do about this. Stop breathing, I guess. He says, I contend that we English are the finest race in the world, and that the more of the world we inhabit, the better it is for the human race. What scheme could we think of to forward this object? I look into history, and I read the story of the Jesuits. I see what they were able to do in a bad cause, and I might say, under bad leaders. In the present day, I became a member of the Masonic order. I see the wealth and power they possess, the influence they hold, and I think over their ceremonies, and I wonder that a large body of men can devote themselves to what at times appear to be the most ridiculous and absurd rites without an object and without an end. The idea, gleaming and dancing before one's eyes, like a will-o'-the-wisp, at last frames itself into a plan. Why should we not form a secret society, but with one object, the furtherance of the British Empire and the bringing of the whole uncivilized world under British rule? So there you have it from the mind of the founder. Back to Quigley. In his own words, he says that the goal of the secret society was, quote, nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. The system was to be controlled in a feudalist fashion by the central banks of the world, acting in concert by secret agreements arrived at in frequent private meetings and conferences. Now, you see the trilateral meetings and the Bilderberg meetings begin to take on more significance when you realize that that's really part of this plan. On page 4 of the Anglo-American Establishment, Quigley says this: this organization has been able to conceal its existence quite successfully, and many of its most influential members, satisfied to possess the reality rather than the appearance of power, are unknown even to close students of British history, partly because of the deliberate policy of secrecy which this group has adopted. You see there he calls it a group, which this group has adopted, partly because the group itself is not closely integrated, but rather appears as a series of overlapping circles or rings, partly concealed by being hidden behind formally organized groups of no obvious political significance. End quote. And then regarding the conspiratorial structure of this group, Quigley tells us this, quote, in the secret society, Rhodes was to be leader. Stead, Brett, Lord Esher, and Milner were to form an executive committee called the Society of the Elect. Arthur, Lord Balfour, Sir Harry Johnston, Lord Rothschild, Albert Lord Grey, and others were listed as potential members of a circle of initiates, while there was to be an outer circle known as the Association of Helpers. Those phrases, ladies and gentlemen, that I just read are lifted from Adam Weishaupt. Those are his phrases. Association of Helpers. This was later organized by Milner as the Round Table Organizations that I mentioned a moment ago. After the death of Cecil Rhodes, the organization fell under the control of Lord Alfred Milner, who recruited young men from the upper class of society to become part of the Association of Helpers, which, as I mentioned, became later known as the Round Tables. Now, this group of young men, recruited from the higher levels of British society, were unofficially called, at that time, Milner's kindergarten. Of course, they were young men. They were coming up in politics and in banking, and they came from the finest families. But they called them Milner's kindergarten because they worked very closely together, and they tutored them and helped them get into positions of authority, especially in government. Now, they were placed into the power centers of society, and eventually they became the Round Table organizations in each of those countries. And so they were the inner circle of a larger circle around them. Now, while reviewing all of this, it's important for us to keep in mind that the primary purpose of a secret society is to keep secrets. It's pretty obvious. But that means that one of their major objectives is deceit. You have to be deceitful if you're going to keep secrets, even if you simply say, I don't know, which Hillary Clinton, I was just informed, who probably attended the last Bilderberg meeting, but when they asked her on camera, did she attend the Bilderberg meeting, she said, I don't know anything about that. And I guess the reporter said, well, your husband attended the last one. And she said, oh, he did? I don't know anything about it. See? Well, anyway, that's what you'd expect. If you have an affiliation with a secret society, you better be prepared for a little bit of deceit or you're not a good member. Now, to the gullible public, these people deny their plans and their goals, obviously, because the public, for the large part, would not necessarily understand them in an approving way. So, they do. They lie a lot. But when they speak to themselves in their own private papers and before conclaves which are expected to remain confidential, they often tell the whole unvarnished truth. And every once in a while, if you're researching all of their papers, you'll find a little gem, which I'm going to, like the one I'm going to read to you now. This one was written by one of Milner's kindergarten. His name, you'll recognize, Arnold Toynbee. He's a renowned historian. He was a professor at the London School of Economics. He was a director of studies at the Royal Institute of International Affairs, which was a front for the Round Table. He was a British intelligence agent and the author of that very famous 12-volume history of the world. It's called A Study of History, which extols the virtue of world government and collectivism. So he's a big guy. In November of 1931, in that issue of International Affairs, which was published as an insider publication just for members of that Round Table, this is what Toynbee said, and this is a gem. He said, I will hereby repeat that we are at present working discreetly, but with all our might, to wrest this mysterious political force called sovereignty out of the clutches of the local national states of the world. And all the time we are denying with our lips what we are doing with our hands, end quote. And that, of course, just makes sense. People want to go to the members of the Council on Foreign Relations and say, are you guys really planning world government and loss of sovereignty and so forth? Of course not, they said. Are you really planning to merge America, the United States, with Canada and Mexico? Absurd. See, this is just part of the game, and you must understand it. Now, world government doesn't just happen by writing some articles or books. Only when people are in control of power centers of society can they bring about massive changes like this. Not scholarship, but power. It's not public opinion, but power. Power is the key. And the power centers of society are what amalgamate and give these people power over their citizens. Now, how this came about, Quigley describes this. It's very interesting what he says. How did this come about? He said, through Lord Milner's influence, these men were able to win influential posts in government, in international finance, and become the dominant influence in British imperial affairs and foreign affairs up to 1939. In 1909 through 1913, they organized semi-secret groups known as roundtable groups. We're covering the same ground here again. In the chief British dependencies and the United States. These still function in 8 countries. The task was given to Lionel Curtis, who established in England and each dominion a front organization to the existing local roundtable group. This front organization, called the Royal Institute of International Affairs, had as its nucleus in each area the existing submerged roundtable group. In New York, it was known as the Council on Foreign Relations and was a front for J.P. Morgan and Company. All right. At last we come to this ubiquitous Council on Foreign Relations. You hear more and more about it. Even increasingly now on the news, you'll say, and here is a word from so-and-so from the Council on Foreign Relations office. And the average gum-chewing public says, that sounds good. I wonder what that's all about. So increasingly, this phrase, CFR, Council on Foreign Relations, is becoming more and more, at least common. People don't know what it is, but they've heard it. So it's no longer frightening when they hear it. So we are informed by Quigley and others that the Council on Foreign Relations was spawned by a secret society, which still exists today, that it is a front for a roundtable group originally embodied in J.P. Morgan and Company, but now the Rockefeller Consortium, and that its primary goal is no longer the expansion of the British Empire, but global collectivism with control in private hands, administered in a feudalist fashion by the central banks of the world. Now, ladies and gentlemen, these are their words, not mine. Now, why is this important? It is important because the members of the Council on Foreign Relations are the rulers of America. Can I back that up? I think I can. Who are the members of the Council on Foreign Relations? It's a very long list. Actually, there's about 4,000 names. And it's available, by the way, if you write to the Council on Foreign Relations office on your own letterhead, especially if it's a corporate letterhead. So I'd like a copy of the annual report. You'll get it.